in the good times, in the bad times, in the questions, in the answers, in the beginnings, in the ends, and I dare say, in the times I get to sit and listen, and even the times I have to get up front and talk. I choose thankful. We've just come through a series as a church where we did the time of your life. And I hope that that was a good series for you. I hope that you benefited from that. And we're going to go into a series called Follow Me, based on a book by David Platt. And we're really looking forward to that one as well. As we sat as a staff and thought about this fall, and we planned out the Time of Your Life series, and then as we thought about moving into Follow Me, we were excited about that. But we came to Thanksgiving, and we had this week in between. And so we were wondering what to do with that. And so we sat and we thought about it, and we thought about it. And then, in what can only be described as a moment of pure, unadulterated inspiration, we came up with thankfulness. We'll talk about thankfulness on Thanksgiving. So here we are. And, that seemed like a really good idea to me at the time, because I didn't know that I would be the one talking. So I was all over it. This is great. And then I found out that I have to speak this week, and the irony is not lost on me. If you ever wonder if God has a sense of humor, I can assure you he does. Because he knew that I was going to be speaking this morning, and he knew that the topic was going to be thankfulness. And I think he enjoyed putting those two things together. So this morning, I appreciate the irony. I appreciate God even more in his sense of humor. That helps me to understand him and relate to him even better myself. But before we go into the rest of the service, let's stop just one more time. And would you join me in bowing your heads and praying that God would do something here this morning beyond what I'm about to do. All right, so let's pray. God, again, I choose thankful to be here and to be able to speak on your behalf. But God, it is not sufficient. I recognize that as thankful as I might be, that's not enough. Without you involved, this is maybe at best a good talk, a nice chat. And so I would ask that by your Spirit that you would come this morning and that you would meet each one of us where we are at. And that you would speak to our hearts in such a way that we know, just as even Ken prayed earlier, that we would know that we have met with you today. And that we cannot walk out of here being the same as when we walked in. Something has to change. Something has to move to another level. And so to that end, God, I would just ask for your blessing upon us. And I ask these things in your Son's name and for his sake. Amen. All right. Well, as I came to this point where I knew I was going to be speaking, I started to try and wrap my head around this whole concept and idea of thankfulness. And I found really quickly that thankfulness is not something that you can put in a nice, neat little box in 30 minutes or less. At least not me. And like I've said before, you don't get rocket science when you're with me. So don't expect it this morning. But what was helpful to me was the idea or the plan of taking and looking at a concept or an aspect of thankfulness. And I've chosen today to try and ask and answer the question, why be thankful? Now, I know immediately what comes to some of our minds, right, is that, well, that's the polite thing. We should be thankful. That's polite. It's politically correct. But I want to push beyond the social conventions this morning, if you will, because there's more here to be mined, I believe. And I want to try and look at this question of why be thankful from two perspectives. The first being the basis for thankfulness, and the second being the benefits of thankfulness. So we'll try and do that. When we consider the video, and even in 1 Thessalonians 5, like it said there, where we're told, and also in Ephesians 5:20, another reference, God says, be thankful in all circumstances. Be thankful in all circumstances. And yet, in other places, even just a few books earlier in John 16, 33, God tells us, hey, you're going to have trouble. There's going to be issues. And they're going to be significant. You know, they're not just little ones. You're going to have big ones in life. How does that work? How do we rationalize being thankful in all circumstances with trouble, with problems, with difficulties? Well, we'll see if we can tackle that a little bit this morning. Before we begin, there's two things. Number one, maybe counterintuitively, I'm going to begin by looking at the benefits. And then I'm going to move to the basis. So don't feel like I've lost all my marbles or something or other. I missed a step. We're going to start maybe backwards and look at that in that order. And secondly, when I talk today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about happiness. And I recognize that there's a distinction between happiness and joy, and I just want to get that on the table. Some of you youth, Pastor Darren's been talking to you about the difference between happiness and joy. And so please don't feel like you need to email me and tell me that I was off base this morning. I hear you, I get you, and I agree with you. There's a distinction between happiness and joy. But the world around us, by and large, operates from the perspective of happiness, not so much joy. And so when they're talking about happiness, we can sort of understand that what they're really looking towards and what we're trying to get to is joy. Okay, and so when I say happiness this morning, you interpret joy, all right? If you understand the distinction there, please apply that. And I'll go on talking about happiness. So to begin, I want to start with a story. And this story goes back to when I was working at the legislature a number of years ago. And already I've lost some of you, haven't I? Because some of you are shocked and appalled that Baynton actually works somewhere other than a church. And a number of you are probably even relieved, right, at that point. But I don't want you to stay fixated on that. It's true, I did work in the real world, and I managed to survive out there for a while. But let's not focus on that. Stick with me and let's go and talk about this story. The story is about a young girl named Nicole. And Nicole was our office assistant. She worked with us at the legislature, and I worked together with her. And she was about, I would say she was in her early 20s. And she was an attractive girl. She was bright. She had a great personality, very vivacious and lots of energy and very personable. And I was surprised to notice over the course of a while that Nicole wasn't the same character that I thought she was. Like something seemed to be wrong. There's something going on in her world. And so one day, as things would have it, she came around and she would deliver the mail. She was actually one of the ones that makes the legislature work, right? There's a lot of people that think they make government go round and round, but she was one of them that actually makes it happen. And so she came by and she was delivering mail and things like that. And rather than dropping it off with my legislative assistant for whatever reason, my door was open. She came into my office and gave it directly to me. And I sensed an opportunity to talk to her. And so I said, "Hey, Nicole, are you happy?" And she looked at me and she said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, are you happy?" And she said, in my job, or, what are you talking about? And so over the next few minutes, as I was able to come get her to the point where she recognized that I was actually sincerely inquiring as to where she was at in her life, she answered me and she said, "No, I'm not happy." And I said, "Well, what would make you happy? Why aren't you happy? She said, well, I don't know. I said, well, what would make you happy, though? You have to have something in mind. And she said, well, yeah, I guess I do. She said, I want to be a bartender in Vancouver. So I said, okay, a bartender in Vancouver. Well, we can work with that. And so I said, not really sensing any significant prohibitions as to why she couldn't accomplish that, I said, well, then why aren't you doing it? And she didn't know. She didn't have a reason. And so I started to ask her some more questions and to probe a little bit beyond that. And over the course of the next 2.5 hours, we had a long conversation about why she wanted to be a bartender in Vancouver and why she thought that might make her happy. And we started to establish in relatively short order that actually it's not just the circumstances that she thought would make her happy. And that really, in fact, it's not realistic to expect that we can just string together circumstances one after another in such a way as that we can be happy. That there's more to it. And I don't have time to go into the whole conversation. That would take us too long. Like I say, it was 2.5 hours. By the end of it, we had probably 20 people in and around my office from our whole floor. And we managed to spend the afternoon, a Friday afternoon, your tax dollars at work. And we talked about this, and we had an awesome conversation. I did manage actually to make up the time later on in ways that they didn't, I think, recognize that we actually made up the time we had lost. So your tax dollars are good. But I like to think that was perhaps some of my best work at the legislature that day. And I'll try and cut to the chase now, because it turns out that there is a lot of thought and study that's been put into this area. The whole concept of us ourselves plus our circumstances not necessarily making us happy. Or another way of looking at it is that despite difficult circumstances, we can still be happy. And that brings me to Gary Habermas. Now, does anybody know Gary Habermas? I don't see any hands. So that's great, because then you're all in the same boat that I was when I met Gary Habermas, okay? And if you want a great laugh sometime, come and talk to me about how I met Gary Habermas. You'll have a laugh. But in the event that you do happen to meet Gary Habermas, between now and then, when I can tell you my story, let me give you just a few things to keep in mind so that it might save you some of the embarrassment that I encountered. Okay, Gary Habermas is perhaps one of, if not the leading authority in the world today on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you've read any of Lee Strobel's books, Case for Faith, Case for Christmas, you've probably, well, you will have, you've run across a quote from Gary Habermas. Lee Strobel interviewed him for his book and includes some quotes from Gary in his book. And Gary is currently, he's the distinguished professor at Liberty University in the United States, but you can probably just as easily run into him at Oxford or Cambridge, as he's invited around the world, literally, to lecture. He's a historian, but he's a philosopher. He's got more brains than he knows what to do with. And on top of it, he's an amazing guy. And so as I knew I was going to be talking about this subject today and wanting to be able to kind of cut to the chase, I emailed him for some resources that he could point to me to as we were speaking today, and that I could point to, and he did. He gave me a number of resources, particularly with regard to how happiness relates to our circumstances, or the myth of how that relates. And he himself has written copious amounts of books and works, papers on the idea of doubt and how that relates to us as individuals and so on and so forth. So if you're interested in this subject, beyond what we talked about this morning, please come and talk to me, and I can give you some of the resources that he pointed me to, and it might be well worth your while. But in the course of our email exchange, as I was asking about this stuff, he gave me a sentence or a statement that just sort of summed it up, and I thought I'd just use it today because it brings us very quickly to the point where we understand that maybe Baynton didn't just dream up this stuff on his own, okay? And so I'll read it to you. He says this: "The very well-established principle itself is that in general, and contrary to much popular opinion, what happens to us are not the most painful things in life. Rather, what we believe, think, and say to ourselves about what happens to us creates many, if not most, of our problems." Okay, I'll read that one more time. "The very well-established principle itself is that in general, and contrary to much popular opinion, what happens to us are not the most painful things in life. Rather, what we believe, think, and say to ourselves about what happens to us creates many, if not most, of our problems." Okay, so as I discovered with as I discovered with Nicole in that story, Gary bears that out. Our circumstances don't equate to happiness. So as it comes to thankfulness then, we find that as we employ thankfulness, as we leverage a perspective of thankfulness in our lives, that will begin to shape and affect the way that we think and see our lives, which will help us to navigate the difficult circumstances and do so more productively, more successfully. So in fact, thankfulness then can lead us to a better quality of life. Okay? So that's a huge benefit. When we employ thankfulness and allow that to be our perspective, then we will benefit and our lives will be that much better despite our circumstances. Now, at this point, you may be sitting here and you're thinking to yourself, okay, Baynton, great. You've given us some great psychology, maybe even a nice self-help philosophy, but we're in church. So there better be more than that. And I would completely agree. And we're going to get to that in just a couple of minutes. But before I do, I want to just park on this just for one more second and think about something, because I think that this is something that I've found interesting and I think it bears noting. And it's the fact that in every case where I have done what God tells us to do, I have benefited, without exception, in my life. Every time I have done what God tells me that I'm to do, regardless of whether or not I've understood why, I've benefited. I've found that it's been beneficial for me to do what God tells me to do. Take, for example, so thankfulness. If I am thankful, as we're seeing here this morning and hearing, that will help me navigate my life better, the difficulties of my life included. Now, I wouldn't necessarily know that until I did it. Forgiveness. God tells us to forgive. And there's some benefits that we see. Forgive so that you too can be forgiven, so on. So there's some tangibles. But we've come to the point in our society, and even as Christians, where we believe, I think, that to forgive is for the offender, not for the offended. But when I actually employ forgiveness, when I exercise forgiveness in my life, I find that perhaps even more so than for the offender, I, as the offended, benefit. What's up with that? God tells us to give rather than receive. Now, we want to receive, don't we? We want to receive. But when I give, I discover a whole nother level of benefits that I would not have known until at such a time as I participate and do what I'm told to do, what God's told me to do. So before we dismiss this as good psychology or a nice philosophy, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. God is no dummy. We're the dummies. Because so often I find we want to argue with him about this and be convinced of why I should do it, because I have what it seemed to me to be mountains of evidence as to why I shouldn't do that. We need to put that aside, learn to engage with God and follow what he tells us to do, because I am assured, I am positive that we will find that we benefit because of it. You know, even the diet that was given to the Israelites in the Old Testament under the law, if we look at it today, with the benefit that we have of our technology and the advancements that we understand and know now about those types of foods and so on and so forth, we find that they were for their benefit. They couldn't have known these things at that time. But under the law, God said, you just do this. And it works out better for them. Let's just do what God tells us to do. All right, so good psychology, nice philosophy. It may have some merit, and it definitely has some benefits, but it will not get us far unless we have the right basis on which to build it. Okay? And so we need to push beyond just the practice itself to understand where that comes from. I can say that I am thankful, right? I can say that today. I can make that statement, but it doesn't help you much, does it? Great, Doug, you're thankful. Why? Well, I can expand on it a little bit more. I am thankful because I was run over by a car. And you're still sitting there and you're shaking your head, right? Like, okay, all right, you give me a little bit more, but there's still not quite enough for me to catch on to where you're going. It's not until I say, I am thankful that I was run over by a car and not the semi, that then now it starts to make some sense, doesn't it? Right? Oh, okay. Well, now I'm following you. Or I could say, I'm thankful that I was run over by a car and that I'm here today to thank you, to tell you that I'm thankful that I was run over by a car. Right? Then we start to understand this. It starts to make sense to us. Now we've got some context. And that's the point. Thankfulness needs context. And therein lies our rub. Because odds are that you and I will find that as we look at our context, we can always extrapolate our context far enough to erode and overcome the context of our thankfulness. Isn't that right? Don't you find that? I find that in different ways. It bears out for me hour to hour some days. I can be thankful about this, and then another hour later, I'm over that. I am not thankful anymore. Ask my wife, ask my kids. Some days it's, day by day. I was thankful yesterday, but today I've run into something that's far bigger, far different. I'm not thankful anymore, let alone week by week, month by month, year by year. We will always find a context that's bigger than our thankfulness, that's negative and overshadows it. I'm thankful I live in Canada. I can say that right now, but in a couple of months, I'm not so sure. 40 below, right? I'm looking at it and saying, no, maybe not so thankful I live in Canada at that point. Or, I can say I'm thankful I live in Canada, but the guy that lives in Ontario, Canada, maybe looking around and saying, yeah, but I don't have a job where I'm at. I don't have work. I can't provide for my family. I'm having to move across the country, things like that. So, Canada, I'm not, not so sure. But, we're in Lloydminster, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Canada. So we don't have a problem with economics. Things are great here. We got jobs. We've got more jobs than we know what to do with. We're looking for people to fill jobs. We can give the jobs to Ontario. Don't tell them that. They'll all move out here. But then I go a little bit further and I find that my marriage is falling apart. And I've got a job, but maybe my kids are in jail. And I'm working and I'm making all kinds of coin, but I just was diagnosed with cancer. Something around the corner is going to pop up that completely erodes our ability to be thankful if we let it. Our own frailties, insufficiencies, inabilities are enough, aren't they? Just in and of ourselves, we've got enough issues that we can overcome the good things, but just by looking at ourselves, the problems that I bring to the table, let alone looking around us at a broken and degenerating world and all of the issues that come with that. And if you're still not convinced, I would submit for your consideration any country song. Yeah, I'm serious. Like, those things have the ability to... You don't listen to a country station if you're happy. It's amazing. I don't know how they can go that far to find the negatives. Anyways, but it's at this point, isn't it, that when we encounter a context that's negative, that's where the self-help gurus come along and they say, well, you need to change your context, change your circumstances, right? That's what we hear. You hear it in the world around us all the time. Well, you don't have a job. Well, you just need to sell yourself a little bit better. Here's how you do it. Oh, you're having trouble in your marriage. Well, you didn't need her anyway. Get rid of her. Let's start over. There's another way to be happy. We'll change your context. Isn't that right? Day in and day out, we get told that there's a way to solve this. And so let's just, for argument's sake, let's just say that we manage to string together a nice life full of decent and good and maybe even above average, maybe even awesome circumstances and situations. We live to be 96. That seems like a pretty decent age. I've been successful, I've made money, my wife's still here, I've still got my marbles, my kids have gone on to be doctors, presidents, win the Nobel Prize, all kinds of things like that. It's been an awesome life. And we die peacefully in our sleep. Go to bed one night after a nice meal and just not wake up. No pain, no struggle, just fading out gently, peacefully. And it's at that point we'll find that we encounter our biggest problem of all. It's the ultimate problem, if you will. It's our ultimate context as man. Because God says that we are appointed once to die and then the judgment. We're appointed once to die and then the judgment, where we're going to stand before Him and He's going to ask us some questions. And God's good enough. He doesn't just pop the quiz on us. He tells us what the exam's going to be about. He tells us what our state is as man. He says that all of us have sinned and come short of his standard. All of us, every one of us. We've all come short of God's standard. And he goes on. He says that in coming short of God's standard, in coming short of my standard, the consequences that go with that is death. The consequence is death. And it's not just a physical death, but it's a spiritual death, and it's an eternal death. It's separation from God himself, which is hell. And there's nothing that we can do about it ourselves. No self-help philosophy is going to bring us through this one. No good psychology is going to bring us through this one. The fact is, we've got a big problem, a huge problem. But in the heart of that problem, at that point, we find the basis for thankfulness. Because God does not leave us there. He gives us an option. He says that because I loved you so much, I sent my son. And he died on a cross to take the penalty for your sin, to pay that consequence on your behalf, so that when you choose him, and when you choose to follow him and put your trust and faith in him, then you don't suffer an eternal separation from God in hell, but you inherit, you receive a gift of life eternally with God in heaven. And that's our basis for thankfulness. Because he's given us an out of the ultimate bad news context that we have as man. That's our basis for thankfulness. Until we know God, and specifically his gift of salvation through Jesus Christ, we will always run into a context that will overshadow our reason for thankfulness. But once we've come to the place where we have placed our trust in him, then not only do we have a benefit there in eternal life with him, but we also have the right foundation on which to be thankful throughout our life, beyond the circumstances, the negatives that we encounter, that will help us to navigate these things successfully without always trying to just change our context, change our circumstance so that we can find happiness. We're limited in our ability to change our circumstances. That's why this isn't self-help, this is God help. Our resources are too small. Our abilities are insufficient. We can't change them. We have to have him come and change them for us. Why be thankful? Because of God. That's why we should be thankful. And because of what he has done for us. And because with him in our lives, we can transcend, that's the word I'm looking for, transcend our circumstance. And we can benefit. We can realize a better quality of life despite the trouble that he tells us that's going to be ours. Let's pray. Father, this morning, on Thanksgiving Day, we stop and we say thank you. And we say thank you primarily for the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ, because in him we find an option that gets us out of the ultimate bad news context that we're in as man. Thank you for his gift of salvation. Thank you that he was willing to come and die in our place so that we could know you and have a restored relationship with you and an eternity with you to look forward to. And beyond that, God, that he is with us even now today when we make that choice to help us to navigate through the darkness and the issues and the difficulties that we encounter hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, in such a way as that we have hope and we have a happiness that the rest of the world doesn't. So as we go into this holiday weekend and beyond, God, would you help us to live in such a way that that would come through so that others would know it. That we wouldn't just benefit ourselves, but that we would be able to demonstrate by who we are and our approach to life the difference that you have made in our lives so that they might come to know it too. And we ask all of these things now in your name. Amen.